Hi, thanks for joining. Before we get started, please make sure you subscribe to follow us on the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes on Threads and in Instagram. Links are in the description. We're going to pick back up a discussion that we had a little while ago looking at do we have a pill for that as relates to exercise, discussing the types and methods of supplementation, particularly dietary supplementation, that we get advertised to do if we happen to be looking at trying to make body compositional changes or trying to get gains in strength and in muscle mass. We're going to focus on two particular types of dietary supplements here. We're going to be looking at protein supplementation and the metabolites of proteins that we use, or the amino acid metabolites that we would use as dietary supplements, more than looking at the fat loss tablets or the thermogenic agents that we discussed when we looked at is there a pill for that. We will touch back up with the different types of thermogenic agents and the different types of quote unquote fat loss supplements that are out there in a different talk, not just the is there a pill for that talk. But there's a lot of discussion, a lot of talk about using protein, using protein supplement, using protein powder, using creatine, using different types of amino acid metabolites as a way to bolster strength gains, as a way to bolster growing muscles in response to doing any type of resistance training. But how true are the claims that are out there, and what is the actual rationale for using those supplements? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
Before we get into the discussion about the supplements, we need to take care of one of the biggest misconceptions. Before we get started with discussing the supplementation issues of protein or of creatine or of the amino acid metabolites, there's one thing we have to take care of, and that is the misconception and misnomer that gets propagated by a lot of the self-proclaimed experts that we might see in our social media or hear about at the gym. And the biggest misconception or misnomer that's out there as relates to protein and resistance training and muscle growth and muscle gains is that we're going to be quote unquote burning protein when we do weight training, when we do exercise. That muscles are going to burn protein. Muscles don't burn protein. Most of the fuel that is used by the skeletal muscle is going to be carbohydrate based. It's going to be glucose, it's going to be fructose, it's going to be a glucose metabolite, it's going to be a fructose metabolite that's being used in order to get fuel, in order to get energy for the cell in the form of ATP, followed by use of fats, followed by the use of fatty acids through a process known as beta oxidation within the mitochondria, particularly when we're doing activities for prolonged periods of time. If we're in a starved state, if we're in a state that is unfed, then we can use some amino acids in the process of generating glucose metabolites in order to get fuel for the skeletal muscles to do the work that we're asking them to do. If we look at muscle contribution to energy in terms of fuel source for exercise purposes, it's excessively limited. We're looking at a very low percentage of total return coming from proteins as a fuel source, even though we look at proteins as one of the four principal fuel sources with carbohydrates, fats, and ketone bodies. So we're not going to quote unquote burn fat, quote unquote burn protein during exercise. But there is a need for additional protein when we look at exercise in an attempt to either increase lean body mass or increase skeletal and skeletal muscle mass following resistance training or following exercise in general. And the principal reason why we have to look at this need for additional proteins is because we have to put ourselves into a positive nitrogen balance. And the idea of positive nitrogen balance is to provide the building blocks to generate proteins. And so we have to go back and think about, okay, how are proteins actually made? And proteins are made by linking together a cluster of molecules known as amino acids. And those amino acids have a nitrogen or an amine in them. And so when we start looking at this idea about protein and protein supplementation for resistance exercise and for gains in muscle, both in muscle mass as well as in strength capability. We're looking at trying to put the muscles into a positive nitrogen balance to allow for additional protein synthesis, to make more proteins than what would normally be there. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about looking at the need for protein supplementation. The other thing we have to look at is, okay, what is my actual requirement for protein? What is my actual requirement for nitrogen or for amino acids? And do I actually need to supplement? That is, am I getting enough from my diet as is? Or do I need more than what is there? And that's where we have to go back and look at, what is my nutrient balance within this? Am I getting my minimums in terms of my balance point? And then am I going slightly above that balance point? And this is where a lot of the self-proclaimed experts and a lot of the gym bros that are going to be giving us advice about nutrition and about diet are going to be recommending excessive amounts of protein consumption, excessive amounts of amino acid consumption, when that excessive amount is not necessary. We cannot store amino acids as amino acids. When we start ingesting too much amino acids, we simply will be passing that amino acids out through either sweat or through urine. We're not going to store it the way that we store other macromolecules in terms of fuel sources, carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, or in the form of fats, fats in the form of fats. Amino acids do not do a lot of conversion into the other forms of molecules unless we're in a fasted state. And that's where we'll get some amino acids that can form glucose metabolites, forming glucose metabolites in the process of gluconeogenesis in order to provide enough glucose for the body to function, or will be broken apart through deamination or transamination, chemical reactions on the amino acids, to provide intermediates in the other energy pathways that will provide the fuels necessary in order to generate ATP within the cell. And those are only going to take place when we have excessive fasting or when we need a slightly higher amount of contribution from amino acids to the fuel source. We usually don't see that when we start looking at resistance training. We will see it when we start looking at endurance training and responses to endurance training, where people who are doing endurance training need slightly higher protein content than people who are doing resistance training. I know it sounds kind of backwards from how we talk about it, but that's metabolically what's happening. And so let's go ahead and let's talk about protein and protein supplementation, and we'll go from there and talk about a couple of amino acid metabolites and creatine supplementation and the benefits that we get and the physiological rationales for doing it. So we start looking at protein and protein supplementation. What to remember is that whenever we're supplementing, it's always about addition to things that we're missing within our diet. When we start looking at proteins, powders as a means to supplement our protein intake and protein intake in general, there's two things we have to look at. First thing we have to look at is what source is that protein, and am I getting complete amino acids from that source, like we've talked about previously? In this, what to remember is that the meat source is always going to be better than any of the other sources that we look at in terms of nutrients and nutritional value that we can get. Now, some of the vegetarians and some of the vegans will come back and say, well, yeah, but you have all these other things in the meat sources that can be counter to overall health. And there are some arguments to that, where looking at vegan and vegetarian sources of protein can have benefits to it. However, if we're looking at complete protein, the meat source, the pork, the beef, the poultry, the fish, the eggs, the dairy, seem to be better in terms of protein and providing essential amino acids, as well as providing essential amino acid metabolites. Taurine, creatine in particular, are better for total overall nutrition than what we can get from our vegetarian sources. The other thing let's look at when we look at vegetarian sources and we look at meat sources and the powder sources is the bioavailability of that protein, of those amino acids that we get, along with all of the minor nutrients, the trace elements, the minor elements that can come about from the food sources. When we start looking at bioavailability, what we're really talking about is how readily can we get that food stuff that we've eaten into the bloodstream and to the tissues and have those substances available at the tissues for use by the tissues. In this case here, the protein powders tend to have a higher bioavailability than the other sources of protein that we might have within our diet. But those protein sources, those powdered sources, may be limited in the other things that they can add to the nutrient balance that we need in our food. And so protein powder, the whey protein powder, the protein blends, the concentrates have a high bioavailability. The other thing that the powders have that we don't get from the other sources is it's typically more condensed, more higher percentage of protein within each serving that we get. For most of the powders, we're getting somewhere between 2 and 3 times the amount in terms of grams relative to the meat sources. In the bars, we're usually getting about equivalent to what we get within our meat sources based on grams per serving. If we look at those sources, the idea that we're getting our protein from the powders provides a higher concentration of the amino acids of the proteins. It ensures that we're going to meet our branched chain amino acid requirements, particularly if we're looking at getting the cow milk proteins, what's usually in the powdered, as long as it's not the vegetarian or the vegan sourced powders. Most of those powders are coming from looking at cow's milk, which is why we have to start looking at a couple of other factors when we address the type of protein supplementation to look at before we start addressing the timing of the protein supplementation. If we start looking at the type of supplementation that we're getting, most of the protein that we get from the powders are going to be one of two forms if we're looking at buying either the protein blends, the protein concentrates, or the protein isolates. And the difference in the concentrates, the blends, and the isolates is simply what other stuff from the milk happens to still be remaining within the powder when we buy it. Of the protein that we see within milk, about 20% is whey, about 80% is going to be the other proteins. Primarily, if we look at what proteins we're trying to get, that would be casein. The remainder of what we see in the milk will be fats and will be sugars or carbohydrates. In the vast majority of those carbohydrates is going to be lactose, which is why we have to be careful if we happen to be lactose intolerant as to which type of protein supplementation we go for. If I happen to be lactose intolerant, if I cannot digest lactose, I don't want to buy the blends. I don't want to buy the concentrates because those will still have a high percentage of lactose within the powder. It doesn't matter if we're looking at buying the powders that are quote unquote low carb or not. Most of the protein powders typically are lower in terms of total carbohydrate load. But what we're looking at those powdered forms. It's what concentrate percent are we getting in terms of protein relative to the other things. If we start looking at the blends, the protein blends, we're looking at by mass, 11 to 14% being the proteins, between 60 and 75% being lactose, and 1 to 2% being the milk fats. If we start looking at the concentrates, we're going to start to reduce the amount of lactose that's there and start increasing the amount of proteins and fats that are there, in which we'll have probably between 10 and 50% lactose, between 25 and 90% protein, and between 2 and 10% being milk fat. If we start looking at the isolates, we're looking at almost entire protein, between 90 and 99% being the protein, in particular the whey protein, with negligible amounts of lactose and milk fats. That's why if I happen to be lactose intolerant, and I want to use the protein powders, I'm going to use the isolates as opposed to using the concentrates or the blends. If I'm not lactose intolerant, it really doesn't matter whether or not I'm going to use the blends or the isolates. If we look at the outcomes from consuming the various types of protein powders, because that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at what is the outcome here. Because we're not going to get true physiological benefits from consuming the protein powders in blend or in whey isolate form As long as there's whey protein in there, we do get cardiovascular benefit. There is a metabolic effect that takes place from the amino acids and from the proteins that make up the whey protein that provide a cardiovascular benefit that is going to help reduce blood pressure and improve cardiac function, improve heart functions, independent of doing any of the exercise, independent of what we see in terms of changes that stem from exercise. And it doesn't matter whether it is coming in the blended form or coming in the isolate form. It doesn't matter if it's coming in the concentrate form or coming in the isolate form. If we start looking at the outcome measures for strength, there's no difference. There is some indication that the blends actually provide better benefit for strength and for size gains than the isolates. If we look at body composition, there is a slight advantage to reduction in fat mass from the isolate than there is from the blends or from the concentrate. But there's no mechanism for explaining that, which means it could simply be because we don't see this across the board in systematic reviews. We see this in a couple of independent studies where those that were on the isolate had a greater body compositional change in reduction of fat mass. But we don't see distinct changes in amounts of fat-free mass, lean body mass, skeletal mass, skeletal muscle mass. Nor do we see drastic differences in strength changes coming from those consuming whey versus those that consume the isolates. If we start looking at timing of protein supplementation, this is where another bit of discussion comes into play. And this is where we have to start looking, okay, what's the physiological reason that we need to have the additional protein? Yes, it's going to help with building of muscles by putting us into that positive nitrogen balance. But the other thing it's going to help do is it's going to help control cortisol responses by providing a large amounts of amino acids within the bloodstream. One of the things that's going to trigger cortisol responses is inflammation, and we get inflammation in response to exercise. The other thing that's going to trigger cortisol is reduction in fuel sources, something that also happens during exercise. As we exercise, the amount of available glucose, the amount of available amino acids, the amount of available fatty acids within the blood start changing. And those changes will start to trigger counter-regulatory responses, increase in glucagon, increase in cortisol, increase in epinephrine in a response to regain blood glucose levels or quote unquote normalize blood glucose levels. This is where we will see spikes in glucose during exercise. And the spikes in glucose that occur during exercise is because of the counter-regulatory responses to exercise in accordance to or in response to those utilizations of all of the fuel sources within the exercise. One of the things that's going to help regulate cortisol is having amino acid availability and having other fuel source availability. Cortisol likes to break proteins down, in particular collagen proteins, to offer up to the liver and offer up to the other tissues that can do some transamination and deamination process. Amino acids to do transamination and deamination, to do conversion into glucose metabolites to allow for continuation of energetic pathways, Krebs cycle, glycolysis, to provide a glucose metabolite so that we can get pyruvate or we can get lactate, which can then get reconverted back into glucose through gluconeogenesis. Cortisol is going to break those tissues down. It's going to break those tissues down. In particular, it's going to break down collagen fibers. If we're providing large amounts of amino acids, which we can do through either consuming a huge amount of protein post-exercise or through consuming of the amino acid drinks, the protein drinks, then we can kind of slow down that cortisol response. It's the same thing that we see when we drink a sugary drink, a drink that has carbohydrates in it, following exercise. We're able to block or blunt the rise in cortisol. And if I'm able to blunt or block the rise in cortisol, then I'm able to accentuate the anabolic response. This is where we get into what's referred to as the anabolic window. And the anabolic window is the time to start to negate cortisol to allow for maximal anabolic response, along with providing the nutrients necessary in order to cause tissue to grow. And this is where we start getting into the conversation of when do I need to have the large amounts of protein? Some people will tell you that you need large amounts of protein immediately afterwards. Some people will tell you that it doesn't matter. As long as you're getting more protein throughout the day to offset the amount of protein being broken down and the amount of protein necessary to build back up what has been broken down during exercise. If we look at all of the evidence that we have, if I can blunt cortisol either through consumption of a carbohydrate and electrolyte drink or through the consumption of a protein drink, it doesn't matter when I consume my additional protein. Most of the growth that we see is going to be taking place between 12 and 48 hours after the exercise session. That's when we're actually going to be doing the growing. So if we start looking at when do I need the additional protein, the additional protein is not during the exercise, and the additional protein is not immediately following the exercise. This is where we misread what the anabolic window is telling us. If I'm able to blunt or if I'm able to block cortisol, then it doesn't matter when I have my protein. If I'm someone that has the habit of having more protein following exercise, then have more protein following exercise. But having more protein following exercise on resistance training is not going to provide an additional hypertrophic advantage. It's not going to lead to greater skeletal and skeletal muscle growth as long as I'm meeting all of the demands throughout the day. So when you start seeing all the people walking around with their protein drinks in the jugs at the gym, and they're doing it because they want to make sure they're not, quote unquote, burning proteins from their muscles, or that they're trying to stimulate the quotes around that muscle growth during the exercise. First, you don't burn proteins during the exercise unless you're doing long duration endurance exercise. Two, the growth that takes place in the muscles is not immediately afterwards. It starts 12 to 48 hours afterwards, or it's during 12 to 48 hours afterwards, when we're going to start seeing that actual growth response. When do I need to have the additional protein? Not immediately afterwards. 12, 48 hours. I need to make sure I'm having larger amounts of protein. It's better to have large amounts of carbohydrates during my resistance exercise and immediately following my exercise, so that I have the fuel source available to the skeletal muscles to do what the skeletal muscles need to do during the exercise. But at the same time, keep that carbohydrate supply elevated so that I'm not going to stimulate response of cortisol in order to meet fuel demands. That's the key here. That anabolic window is all about fuel demands. And do I need to break apart proteins in order to meet those fuel demands? If I'm lifting in a fasted state, I will see a doubling on the spike of cortisol. I'm going to see a spike of cortisol in response to inflammation. I'm going to see a spike of cortisol in response to starvation. That spike of cortisol in response to starvation is going to minimize the amount of anabolic response I can get, which is going to minimize the amount of muscle growth I can get. I do not want to lift in a starved state if my goal is to gain muscle mass. If I'm looking at losing body mass, lifting in a fasted state is fine. However, I'm not going to have the same amount of power output. I'm not going to have the same amount of strength. I'm not going to have the same amount of force development as I would have in a fed state because of the lack of fuel availability. That lack of fuel availability means that in response to lifting, I'm not going to have the speed of recovery that I would have normally, which means I'm not going to be able to regrow tissues fast enough in order to allow for hypertrophication, allow for growth to take place. Can I get stronger in a fasted state? Yeah. Can I get more endurance in a fasted state? Sure. Can I get bigger and stronger in a fasted state? Heck no. And that's where utilizing amino acid supplementation and protein supplementation comes into play if I'm looking at lifting in a fasted state, because I'm going to be able to control the amount of cortisol in response. And by controlling the amount of cortisol in response, I'm going to be maximizing my anabolic window. Whenever you hear about anabolic window, it's simply looking at the timeline in between when do I lift and when am I going to start seeing growth of the tissues. In that anabolic window, that 12 to 48 hours, If I'm not in a positive nitrogen balance, I'm not going to see hypertrophication. I have to be in a positive nitrogen balance. I have to have more amino acids. I have to have more protein. But in between the end of the exercise and when I start seeing my anabolic window being maximized, it's not necessarily about amino acid consumption. It's about fuel consumption, having carbohydrates, having fats, having other things, ketones, other things that can provide the fuel sources for the body. So I'm not going to be stimulating the release of cortisol in order to free up the amino acids that are necessary for gluconeogenesis, that are necessary for glucose intermediates in the energetic pathways, so that I'm able to utilize those amino acids that have been broken apart from the skeletal muscles, from the proteins that make up the skeletal muscle. I'm going to have those amino acids available for starting the rebuilding process following the exercise. So when we start looking at this protein supplementation, powder can be a very good alternative to whole food source post-exercise for a couple of reasons. One is that high degree of bioavailability. The other is the ease of digestion. The protein powders tend to be easier to digest than the whole source protein. And because of cardiac drifts and cardiac shifts that are taking place within exercise and following exercise, having something that is easier to digest, easier to absorb, is going to be less taxing. It's going to have a less stress on the body. It's going to lead to a reduced risk for gastrointestinal issues, digestive issues that can come into play following exercise if I'm attempting to eat large whole protein sources. If I'm looking at bioavailability between protein sources, this is where the golden age bodybuilders actually got it right. This is where, if you're a fan of the Rocky movies, Rocky got it right. Whole eggs are just as good as those powdered protein sources in terms of bioavailability. They have the exact same bioavailability score. The isolates have slightly higher bioavailability than the blends do, than the concentrates do. But if we look at all of the overall outcomes of everything, by price comparison, the isolates are going to be the least economically feasible for most individuals. And that's where you have to start looking at this idea about protein supplementation and protein powder versus whole source versus eggs versus dairy. What is going to be the economical cost to me when I'm looking at trying to get that additional nitrogen, the additional protein necessary in order to build larger muscles, build stronger bones, have greater strength output, see the growth that I want to see from the resistance exercise? When we start looking at this, changes in muscle mass, changes in lean body mass from resistance exercise, there's other amino acids and amino acids metabolites that we start talking about and start discussing. One of the ones that is the most popular is creatine. And so let's talk a little bit about creatine. Creatine is a non-protein amino acid. So when we say non-protein amino acid, we're simply saying that it's an amino acid that isn't directly involved in producing proteins. It's not one of the essential or non-essential amino acids that we look at. We start looking at and listing out the 21 amino acids that are necessary for us to eat or necessary for protein synthesis in our body. Creatine is an amino acid that is generated by all mammals, all animals, all vertebrates in particular. And it's generated by metabolizing methionine, glycine, and arginine in either the liver or the kidney in order to produce this metabolite creatine. And creatine is important for metabolic functions. It's important for metabolic functions, in particular important for regenerating adenosine triphosphate, ATP, for the cells of the body. Which remembers that ATP is our energy molecule, and we need ATP in order to do every little thing that the cell needs to do in order to work, in order to be alive, from movement to sending action potential in the neuron, to making new proteins, to breaking apart foodstuffs in order to get the stuff that we need. All of that's going to require ATP. Creatine is either going to be replenished directly from what we eat or by getting enough glycine and arginine with a smidging of methionine in order to synthesize it within the liver and the kidney from what we eat. We need to consume around 6 grams of creatine in order to offset what is being lost in a day. The idea that comes about with creatine and with creatine supplementation is that if I have more creatine in my diet, if I take creatine supplementation, that means I'm going to load the muscles with more creatine and then have a greater ability to reproduce ATP. So that's predominantly what the creatine is doing, is it's reproducing, or it's being involved with the reproduction of ATP by forming an intermediate known as creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine through an enzymatic reaction with an enzyme known as creatine kinase. While we can see an increased level of store of creatine and creatine phosphate within the body, it's capped. It's capped at around 120 to 160 milligrams per kilogram of body mass, per kilogram of muscle mass. That's the cap, which means that if I'm below that cap, if I consume additional creatine, I'm going to see that level of creatine rise in the body. The only way that I can be able to gain more creatine in the body is by gaining more muscle mass. And so a lot of the studies that we see that talk about this benefit of creatine, it's very difficult to separate the benefit of creatine from what we see as benefit from exercise. The other thing we have to look at when we start looking at creatine and benefits that might come from creatine is how that creatine is consumed. So we need to make sure that we're training at higher relative intensities than what we normally would train at in order to maximize benefit of the metabolic processes that would need the creatine, in particular what's referred to the phosphagen pathway to regenerate ATP. When I train at very, very high intensities, I'm not only going to trigger greater amounts of muscle mass gain, but I'm also going to trigger changes in enzyme development, in particular creatine kinase development, which means it's going to allow me to increase the need and utilization of creatine and creatine phosphate. One of the things that we get as we start training at higher levels of intensity is changes in overall enzymatic pathways, which includes that change in creatine and creatine kinase pathway. We're also going to change mitochondrial pathways. That's going to change all of our energetics. That's how we get greater levels of endurance by training at high intensities. That's how we're able to get better power and better strength, because we're able to get more ATP, get more muscle mass, get more creatine, get more everything. It's not just the creatine that's coming into play. This is where we have to be very careful with some of the conclusions that we see in some of the studies that stipulate the changes that we see is coming from the creatine. With that kind of caveat out of the way, we have to look, okay, what benefits might we get? The primary benefit that we look at is either changes in body composition, changes in athletic performance, or changes in cardiovascular health. Those are the classical studies. Those are the classical points of evidence that we have. Before we get to those, I'm going to talk about one that isn't regularly discussed, but it's something that we have to look at if we're talking about supplementation for overall health. And that is creatine supplementation for neuron health. One of the things that we've seen over the last about decade is that supplementation of creatine for people who have suffered head trauma, suffered a concussion, or have been suspected of having a concussion. people who have neurodegenerative diseases or people who are predisposed to neurodegenerative diseases. People with Alzheimer's, people with Parkinson's, people with Lewy body. MS has not been shown to have this issues, but people with regular age-related dementia. If we supplement with additional creatine at the post-loading phase, and we'll get to loading phase versus maintenance phase here in a second. If we supplement at the maintenance phase of creatine, there is improvement in neuron function, there is a reduction in the rate of decline, and a reduction in the rate of loss. If decline has already started, for people who have neurodegenerative diseases, there is a increased rate of recovery for people who have had traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, or have had concussions, or who are suspected of having a concussion, if they utilize creatine within the treatment. There's two rationales for this. Rationale number one is going to go with one of the risk factors that people talk about when we talk about creatine supplementation, and that is movement of fluids into the neuron. One of the things that creatine can do is it can generate an osmotic draw movement of water into the tissue by causing ion movement. What that does is that reestablishes hydration factors within the tissue that reduces dehydration, inflammatory signals within the brain, within the central nervous system, that reduces total inflammation taking place. The other thing that is done is that the creatine supplements the amount of creatine within the mitochondria of the neurons. And by supplementing the amount of mitochondrial creatine, what it does is it reduces ROS, reactive oxidative species, accumulation, which reduces tau protein formation, amyloid protein formation. And by reducing tau protein formation and amyloid protein formation, it reduces axonal plaque formation within the central nervous system, which reduces neurodegenerative disease issues. That change in ROS, that change in inflammation, is also linked with changes in neurotransmitter, in particular, the activating neurotransmitters, dopamine, glutamine, and reduction in or normalization in serotonin and GABA signaling within the limbic area of the brain. For individuals that have neurodegenerative diseases, people who are susceptible of having concussions or TBI, that leads to normalization of mood and a reduction in some of the symptoms of chronic traumatic encephalopathy issues that are seen with people who have had repeated concussions or repeated subconcussive injuries, which is where utilization of creatine is, even though we talk about this in terms of changes in muscle mass, changes in muscle strength, changes in athletic performance, has a benefit to it outside of that realm. Now, if we look at what goes on within the other aspects of health, when we start looking at cardiovascular health, when we start looking at heart health, when we start looking at musculoskeletal functions, most of the evidence that we look at comes from studies that look at two key factors within the creatine supplementation. Unlike when we start looking at the protein supplementation, when it's, okay, take a scoop, take 2 scoops, get your amino acid load, make sure you have the correct amount of nitrogen balance for the body. Creatine and creatine supplementation comes in a couple of waves. The first wave is what's usually referred to as the loading phase. And the loading phase is where you're going to consume creatine somewhere around 20 to 25 grams per day, broken up into 4 equal doses over 1 week. This equates to about 0.3 grams per kilogram of body mass for most of the studies. That is then followed by a maintenance phase that is somewhere between 3 and 5 grams per day, or the equivalent of one of those 4 loading doses that we had during the first week. That is then followed for somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks. That is then followed by a washout phase. That's where we stop doing supplementation for about a week before you cycle back again. The result of the supplementation is that for most individuals who are not getting enough creatine from their normal diet and have not maxed out their cap, is a creatine load that it nears the upper limit of storage. That allows for the increased availability of creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine. If we see a subsequent increase in creatine kinase, that means that they're training at appropriate intensities. The hypothetical end result is that the person is going to be able to regenerate ATP more quickly and thus will be able to produce work at higher intensities, meaning they're able to produce greater amounts of strength and greater amounts of power relative to someone that is not supplementing. That's going to lead to improvements in both anaerobic as well as aerobic thresholds. That's going to lead to an increase in muscle mass and strength adaptations. That's going to lead to an increase in work capacities and what's referred to as training tolerance. Training tolerance is how hard, put quotes around that, can I work before fatigue starts to set in? The modifications that we see are supported based off the idea of creatine and creatine supplementation having an impact on energy balance. That is my ability to regenerate ATP independent of needing fuel sources. But at the same time, there seems to be a reduction in fat mass. That reduction in fat mass has led to speculation that there's a thermogenic effect that creatine has. There is no evidence to support that speculation. Most of the change in fat mass is going to generally accompany increased level of exercise and changes in overall lifestyle, which are typically associated with alterations in body composition and reduction in fat mass. The same indications that we see in terms of benefit of creatine is not universally accepted, nor is the rationale for increased concentration of creatine within the muscle itself be an indication for improvements coming from creatine supplementation. The lack of evidence for consistent support is based on the inability to control many of the variables within studies, the training intensities and volumes of the exercise, the type of test subjects, the level of creatine and creatine kinase present prior to testing, which means that we're drawing conclusions based off of limitations in the study and the study designs, which is where creatine supplementation may work for some individuals in terms of changes in performance, changes in body composition, where it may not work for others. The inability to separate benefits coming exclusively from the creatine supplementation and not from other nutrients, such as proteins, carbohydrates, and fats within the diet, is going to impact our ability to generalize outcomes to everybody. And we have limited evidence to indicate that creatine has a beiging effect on our adipose tissue. That is, we have a limited effect that creatine by itself causes beiging, causes the white adipose tissue to start look like brown adipose tissues, and increased thermogenic effect. That is, utilizing lipids and fats for non-ATP purposes, but for heat energy purposes, thus leading to a reduction in fat mass or a change in overall health status from those who usually express over fatness within the fitness and fatness continuum. With that in mind, because it's not universally accepted, everybody's going to fall somewhere on the continuum. If you're someone that is thinking about trying to supplement with creatine, there is no adverse effects that have been recorded to creatine supplementation by itself outside of some cramping that might occur during the loading phase that is associated with changes in osmotic conditions and hydrostatic balance due to the nature of creatine and the movement of creatine across the membranes causing movement of ions, leading to changes in fluid movement with it. If we start looking at creatine supplementation in terms of generating larger muscle, changes of levels of testosterone and other factors that we have indications that it might impact, there's no universal impact that it causes changes in any of the testosterone or any of the anabolic hormones, which means that it's not an anabolic agent in itself. If I'm below my cap in creatine and I am not consuming enough creatine, I'm not consuming enough animal protein in a day to make up for the 6 grams that I need, and I supplement with creatine, I may be able to work at higher intensities simply because I'm able to get my creatine store where it needs to be in order to allow me to work at higher intensities. And if I'm able to work at higher intensities, then I'll be able to have greater training responses. If we look at the other thing that creatine gets kind of linked with in terms of responses in the body, we also have to look at creatine in terms of improvements in cardiac functions and improvements in overall heart health. And there is some indication that we see improvements in aerobic fitness and improvements in time trial for people who have cardiac issues already and supplement with creatine. That is, people who have heart disease. If we supplement with creatine at 3 to 5 grams per day, that maintenance phase, we see improvements in heart muscle contractions. We see reduction in blood pressure, reduction in peripheral resistance. That seems to be linked with movement of calcium ions more than anything else. That improvement in movement of calcium ions seems to improve all of the heart functions. That leads to the improvement in aerobic fitness. That leads to the improvement in time trial performance. That is, how far can I go in a set amount of time? There is no indication that there's going to be improvement for people who do not have any type of heart disease issues from creatine supplementation in heart health or in cardiac functions. Just like what I mentioned in terms of neuron functions, in terms of reduction in oxidative species, ROSs, there is some indication that creatine supplementation for people who have metabolic issues, people who are expressing overfatness, there is indication that for people who are expressing overfatness and have signs and symptoms of cardiac health issues, there is a reduction in cardiac inflammation and a reduction in circulating levels of oxidative stress markers from supplementing with creatine. That may mean that creatine supplementation has an impact on metabolic health and can reduce non-communicable diseases, but we don't have the evidence to say that this is 100% true. Creatine is not the only amino acid or amino acid metabolite that is known to have some sort of benefit in terms of supplementation. Other ones that we have discussed or looked at in terms of having benefit include things like leucine, L-arginine, beta-alanine, carnitine, taurine, beta-hydroxybeta-methylbutyrate or HMB. As a group, the compounds have been attributed to improved performance at high intensities of exercise. While some have indicated having improvements in aerobic metabolism, others tend to get associated with changes in body composition. Some of them tend to have benefits when we start looking at people who are elderly or people who are restricted in terms of their nutrient intake, in particular for protection against reduction of fat-free mass, maintaining of lean body mass, maintaining of muscle mass, which is something that tends to get lost when we have high amounts of inflammation or when we tend to have large amounts of nutrient restriction. In this, there's a couple of caveats that we have to look at in terms of benefits that can come about from these other supplements. Carnitine is necessary in order to move the fats for energy purposes into the mitochondria, where if I am utilizing a ketogenic diet or if I am having prolonged starvation, such as when I'm in nutrient restricted diets, I need to make sure that I'm supplementing with carnitine so that I'm able to utilize the fats as fuel sources within the energy pathways, which is where it becomes important in terms of that benefit. HMB tends to have an apparent effectiveness at enhancing muscle mass and strength, independent of how much exercise is being done or the level of exercise that's being done. However, we don't have a dose knowledge for HMB, or if there happens to be habituation to HMB in terms of its ability to trigger changes in strength, changes in muscle mass. For taurine is an amino acid that is involved with mitochondrial functions. We tend to see taurine as being important in mitochondrial functions, important in aerobic metabolism, and is necessary for aerobic metabolism. It can increase the efficiency of our energetic pathways. We may see taurine as an added thing to the quote unquote energy drinks, with the stipulation that is providing a stimulant in terms of energetic availability, in terms of alertness. Taurine supplementation has been indicated as having impacts on neuron functions, which is where that idea about benefit in terms of alertness, in terms of feeling more energetic can come from, particularly if I happen to be either taurine deficient or if I happen to have a high amount of adenosine in circulation where I am fatigued. Because remember, adenosine is going to be that fatigue signal. Taurine is going to make mitochondria function more efficiently and allow for a greater ATP return within the neurons, which will allow the neurons to function more efficiently, which can lead to an increase in my feeling of alertness, my feeling of arousal, my general level of energetics. If we start looking at some of the other ideas around these amino acids in amino acid metabolites, a couple of them have been linked with ideas pertaining to increases of growth hormone, in particular L-arginine. In fact, if you go to the health food stores, you may see L-arginine as one of the supplements with the indication that it helps with growth hormone or helps with growing lean body tissue. The evidence that we have towards L-arginine having this impact can come about if I happen to actually inject large amounts of L-arginine directly into the bloodstream for rodents and rodent models only. The idea that L-arginine by itself is going to trigger growth hormone responses is limited. The indication that it has any type of evidence for benefit is limited in terms of increasing growth hormone independent of the increases in growth hormone that we see from resistance training from exercise itself. And so if we start looking at the other types of metabolites that can be used, the other types of amino acids and amino acid metabolites that can be used, there's a lot of conjecture about benefits that we don't seem to have evidence to support. Outside of the need for carnitine in terms of getting fats into the mitochondria to allow for higher amounts of aerobic metabolism to take place, the utilization of taurine in terms of ATP regeneration within the mitochondria. The other ones that we have, we don't have a lot of evidence to support the need for supplementation. The purported benefits that we get are not as large as what we get from the reports, particularly the advertising reports or the marketing reports. And that's what we have to remember, is that a lot of these reports that we're seeing are advertising and marketing reports in terms of trying to get people to purchase those supplements, as opposed to the evidentiary studies that say that these supplements actually are of benefit in terms of their work. So taurine can have a benefit to it. However, it's only going to have a benefit if we happen to be taurine deficient. And if I'm eating normal meat in terms of my sources of protein, I will be getting enough taurine to replace the taurine that is being used up during normal metabolic functions throughout the day. Independent of causing enough stimulus for growth hormone, L-arginine, or unless I'm going to bolus the L-arginine directly into my bloodstream, L-arginine in itself is not going to lead to a spike in growth hormone, which is going to lead to growth responses independent of exercise. H&B can have a energetic benefit to it, particularly if I'm happening to look at doing stuff in a nutrient deficient state, or if I'm trying to control inflammation, meaning that I'm elderly in terms of benefit, trying to limit the amount of lean body mass being lost due to the inflammation responses, which is where we get some reports about prevention of sarcopenic changes in elderly from people who supplement with HMB. The last thing we have to look at in terms of protein supplementation and amino acid supplementation that a lot of people talk negatively about is the idea that protein supplementation and amino acid supplementation causes a stress to the kidneys. There is limited evidence to support that claim. For individuals who are normally hydrated and individuals that do not have a family history of kidney issues, There is no indication that supplementation with amino acids or supplementation with protein will cause kidney issues. If I'm supplementing with amino acids or supplementing with creatine or supplementing with protein, I may see increases in a metabolite known as creatinine. Elevated levels of creatinine within the urine is an indication of elevated levels of muscle breakdown and or stress to the kidneys. And when I start seeing this elevated level of creatinine without looking at circulating levels of creatine and creatinine within the blood, it can be a misreading as to stress being placed on the kidney, which is where some people will indicate that high amounts of protein, high amounts of amino acids, high amounts of creatine can have a negative impact on kidney and on kidney health in terms of supplementation. So we really don't have that issue coming into play as long as we stay normally hydrated, as long as we do not have a family history for any type of kidney issue. So what's the take-home message? What can we say about protein supplementation, creatine supplementation, amino acid metabolite supplementation? There is a needed benefit to having additional protein in our diet if we happen to be doing any type of exercise. That additional protein can come about through either supplementation or simply increasing the amount of protein consumed within a diet. However, what we want to do is we want to look at these protein supplements as supplements, not as replacements. There's limited evidence to support replacement of meals with protein powders, protein supplementations, amino acid supplementations, creatine supplementation. For those that are vegetarian, utilizing plant protein powders seems to have the same additive benefit that people who are omnivores get, the people who eat meat get from utilizing protein powders in addition to what is normally consumed within the diet. The type of protein powder really doesn't seem to matter as long as we're getting that protein powder. The isolates seem to be just as beneficial as the concentrates or the blends in terms of outcome benefits. Most evidence showing greatest benefit coming from those that are consuming the blends relative to the concentrates or the isolates, with the exception of that possible reduction in fat mass. However, there is no actual kind of physiological trigger to explain why that is taking place. Where as long as I'm not having issues with lactose, there's no reason to spend the additional money for the isolates. If we start looking at the creatine and the other metabolites in terms of addition, as long as I'm getting my necessary requirements for creatine, for taurine, for carnitine, there's no need to do the supplementation. If I'm in some sort of nutrient deficit, if I have high amounts of inflammation, if I am elderly, having those additive benefits, having those supplements provides an additive benefit, a protective benefit to additional loss. There is assumption of purported benefits that can come about from taking these supplements, from having the additional protein in the diet. However, most of these purported benefits come about through antidotes that are negating benefits that arise from lifestyle changes as well as increase in exercise and exercise intensity. Most of the benefit we can get from creatine and from any of the other amino acids or amino acid supplements seem to be within the maintaining dosage as opposed to the loading dosage. There is no indication for having any type of health risk to using these supplements, which means that if I choose to use the supplements, it's not going to be detrimental to my overall health. There can be some issues in terms of cramping or in terms of bloating as relates to creatine supplementation if I am consuming in the loading phase dosage, that is the 20 to 25 grams per day. However, in the maintenance phase, there seems to be no indication for that cramping or for that bloating. There is no indication to support the opinion that there's an increased risk for kidney disease coming about from using these supplements or taking additional protein, as long as I have normal kidney functions, normal kidney health, not susceptible to kidney issues, and am normally hydrated, which means I'm not in a dehydrated state. Well, hopefully you got a little bit out of the conversation here as it relates to protein supplementation and whether or not you should go about doing protein supplementation and when you should do protein supplementation in terms of the anabolic window, as well as whether or not other protein or amino acid supplements such as creatine, creatine, taurine, carnitine, L-arginine, or HMB might be a benefit to you in terms of obtaining that health benefit coming about from resistance exercise in combination with any type of other lifestyle changes. Please make sure that you're giving us that big 5-star rating. Make sure you give us that big thumbs up. Let us know that we're doing a good job. Make sure that you're subscribed. Share out with all of your friends and family what all the various publications here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. And you can find all of those links in the description. And if you happen to have a specific dietary supplement you'd like us to cover or talk about, please drop us a line. Let us know which supplement you'd like us to tell you more about, give you a little bit of background in terms of what it might physiologically do, and whether it's worth the money that you're investing in purchasing that supplement.